When 16-year-old Jake Thompson answered taking care of family to what teenagers spend time doing, the silence that followed wasn't just surprise. It was recognition that sometimes wisdom comes in packages too young to carry such weight. But it wasn't just his answer that stopped Steve Harvey cold. It was the way Jake said it, with the exhausted certainty of someone who had learned responsibility before he'd learned how to drive. The cameras kept rolling, but this wasn't entertainment anymore. This was the moment when America met its youngest caregiver, proving that sometimes the biggest hearts beat in the smallest bodies. Tuesday afternoon at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta began with typical teenage energy from the Thompson family. They were from Cincinnati, Ohio, 3 generations representing everything that made families strong. But there was something different about 16-year-old Jake Thompson that caught the production team's attention during rehearsal. While other teenagers were taking selfies and joking around, Jake sat quietly, checking his phone with the focused attention of someone monitoring something important. Jake Thompson looked exactly like what you'd expect from a 16-year-old, medium height with brown hair that never quite stayed in place, wearing a blue button-down shirt that his grandmother had insisted looked respectable for television. But his eyes held a depth that seemed impossible for someone his age, the kind of seriousness that comes from carrying responsibilities that most adults struggle with. Standing beside him was his mother, Jennifer Thompson, 38, a registered nurse whose proud but worried expression suggested she understood exactly what her son had been sacrificing. Completing their family lineup were Jake's aunt Patricia, 45, and his cousin Michael, 21, both of whom had learned to provide the support system that Jake rarely asked for but desperately needed. What the studio audience couldn't know was the reason he'd almost missed this taping entirely. 2 hours before they were scheduled to leave for Atlanta, Jake's grandfather, 73-year-old Robert Thompson, who had raised Jake since he was 7, had experienced one of his increasingly frequent episodes of confusion. Alzheimer's disease had been stealing pieces of the man who had been Jake's father figure, leaving behind moments of clarity punctuated by frightening periods of disorientation. The diagnosis had come when Jake was 14, old enough to understand what Alzheimer's meant but young enough to believe that love and determination could somehow slow its progression. His mother worked double shifts at the hospital to cover mounting medical expenses, which meant Jake had naturally assumed the role of primary caregiver during evening and weekend hours. Jake's routine had become a careful choreography of school, caregiving, and the few hours of sleep he managed to squeeze in between. Mornings began at 5:30 with checking on his grandfather, preparing breakfast and ensuring medications were taken properly. After school, while his classmates attended sports practice or hung out at the mall, Jake hurried home to help with afternoon medications, prepare dinner, and provide constant supervision. The social costs had been significant. Jake had quit the basketball team he'd loved, stopped attending school events, and gradually lost touch with friends who couldn't understand why he was never available for spontaneous activities that defined teenage social life. But Jake had also discovered strength he hadn't known he possessed. He had learned to manage medical emergencies with calm efficiency, to redirect his grandfather's confusion with patient creativity, and to find joy in small moments of connection when the disease temporarily retreated. During family introductions, Steve had approached them with his characteristic warmth, immediately sensing something different about Jake's presence among the typical family dynamics. "The Thompson family from Cincinnati. Y'all ready to play some Family Feud?" Jennifer stepped forward as the family spokesperson. "We're absolutely ready, Steve. This is my son Jake, my sister Patricia, and her son Michael." Steve approached Jake with the easy camaraderie he typically shared with teenage contestants. "Jake, 16 years old, what do you like to do for fun, young man?" Jake's response was immediate, but carried weight. "I like spending time with my grandfather, Mr. Harvey, teaching him card games and listening to his stories when he remembers them." Something in the way Jake mentioned his grandfather, with protective tenderness rather than typical teenage reluctance, caught Steve's attention. The game progressed well through the first 4 rounds. During commercial breaks, production assistants noticed Jake's constant phone monitoring, initially assuming typical teenage social media habits before realizing his attention was focused on text updates rather than entertainment. But it was during the 5th round that everything changed. The category that appeared on the board seemed straightforward: name something teenagers spend time doing. Jake had been selected to answer, his first time approaching the podium alone during the entire game. He walked forward with steady composure, but something in his expression suggested this question carried more complexity than it appeared. Steve read the question with his usual enthusiasm, expecting typical teenage responses about social media, sports, friends, or entertainment. Jake, here we go, buddy. Name something teenagers spend time doing. Jake looked back at his family, his eyes moving to his mother, whose expression carried both pride and concern. When he spoke, his voice was clear and steady, carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious reality. Taking care of family. The studio fell completely silent, not the brief pause of audience consideration, but the profound quiet that comes when people suddenly understand they have just heard something that challenges every assumption about teenage priorities. Steve's expression shifted immediately, something in Jake's tone, the absence of complaint, the acceptance of responsibility, the quiet dignity, told him this was more than an unusual game show response. Taking care of family, Steve repeated slowly, studying Jake's face. Jake nodded, his composure steady despite the weight of what he was about to share. Yes, sir. My grandfather has Alzheimer's, and I help take care of him. Most teenagers my age are worried about homework and dating, but I spend my time making sure he takes his medicine and stays safe. The revelation hit the studio like a physical force. The audience sat in stunned recognition of what they were hearing from someone who should have been concerned with typical teenage problems. How long have you been taking care of your grandfather, Jake? Steve asked gently, walking closer to where he stood at the podium. Jake straightened slightly, drawing on reserves of strength that had carried him through 2 years of caregiving responsibilities. Since I was 14, Mr. Harvey. The doctors said it was important for him to stay in familiar surroundings with people he loves, so my mom and I made sure he could stay home with us. What does that look like day to day? Steve continued, completely abandoning the game show format. I get up early to help him with his morning routine, Jake explained, his voice growing stronger. Make sure he takes his medications. Help him get dressed if he's having a confused day. After school, I come home and we usually work on puzzles or look through photo albums. The pictures help him remember sometimes. The studio was completely silent. Even the production crew had stopped their usual activity, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. And your friends? Steve asked. What did they think about all this? Jake paused, and for the first time his composure cracked slightly. Most of them don't really understand, Mr. Harvey. They invite me to things, but I can't usually go because I need to be home. After a while, they stopped asking. Behind him, Jennifer was crying openly, not from sadness but from overwhelming pride, watching her son articulate the sacrifices he'd made without ever complaining. Jake, Steve said softly, what do you want people to know about what you're doing? Jake considered the question carefully. I want them to know that taking care of family isn't a burden, Mr. Harvey. My grandfather taught me how to ride a bike, helped me with homework when I was little, came to every basketball game before he got sick. Now it's my turn to take care of him. His voice grew stronger. I want other kids who might be going through something similar to know they're not alone, and I want people to understand that teenagers can step up when their families need them. Steve Harvey found himself facing something he had never experienced. This wasn't just a teenager sharing a difficult family situation. This was a young man who had transformed potential victimhood into purposeful caregiving, who spoke about sacrifice with wisdom beyond his years. Stop the clocks, Steve called out, his voice carrying across the studio with unprecedented authority. Stop everything. The game show timers froze, the music cut out, the audience held its collective breath. Steve walked to the center of the stage, positioning himself so he could address the entire studio while staying close to Jake. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve began, we just met someone who understands what love looks like when it's tested. We just heard from a young man who has chosen responsibility over convenience, family over friends, and caregiving over carefree teenage life. He gestured toward Jake. This 16-year-old has been doing work that most adults find overwhelming. He's been providing care, comfort, and dignity to his grandfather while his classmates worry about prom dates and college applications. Jake Thompson, Steve said, turning to face him directly, you are 16 years old, and you have more character, more integrity, more understanding of what family means than most people develop in a lifetime. You didn't choose this responsibility, but you chose how to handle it, and that choice reveals who you really are. Jake was emotional now, but his tears were mixed with relief, the relief of having his experience acknowledged and his sacrifice recognized. Steve walked closer to Jake. And I need everyone to understand something. This young man could have resented his situation, could have complained about missing out on teenage experiences. Instead, he chose love. He chose to show up every single day with patience, dedication, and respect for the man who helped raise him. Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal business card. "Jake," he said, "this has my personal phone number on it, because what you're doing, caring for your grandfather with such dignity and love, that's extraordinary, and if you ever need support, resources, or just someone to talk to, you call me." But Steve wasn't done. He began removing his suit jacket, the gesture that had become his signature in moments of profound recognition. "This jacket," Steve said, approaching Jake and draping it around his shoulders, "goes home with someone who has redefined what it means to be a responsible family member. Someone who has shown us that age doesn't determine capacity for love, sacrifice, and care." Steve turned to address the entire studio again. "You know what we're going to do? We're going to finish this game, but more importantly, we're going to make sure Jake gets the support he needs to continue being the extraordinary grandson he's chosen to be." As the show concluded, Steve made an unprecedented announcement. His foundation would provide respite care services for Jake's grandfather, ensuring that Jake could attend school events and maintain friendships while continuing his caregiving responsibilities. But the most powerful moment came when Steve addressed Jake directly one final time. "Jake," he said, "I want you to look right into that camera and tell every young person watching who might be facing family responsibilities that feel too big to handle that they can do it." Jake looked directly into the main camera, his 16-year-old voice carrying the authority of earned experience. "To anyone who's taking care of family members, especially other teenagers," he said, "I want you to know that what you're doing matters. It's hard, and sometimes it feels like you're missing out on being young, but you're learning things about love and responsibility that will make you stronger forever." His voice grew steadier. "Your family needs you, and that's not a burden, it's an honor. You're making a difference in someone's life every single day, and that's something to be proud of." Behind the cameras, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Crew members who had worked on hundreds of episodes found themselves profoundly moved by this teenager's wisdom and grace. As the show concluded, Alzheimer's advocacy organizations in the studio audience began approaching Jake to share resources and connect him with other young caregivers facing similar challenges. Jake's courage in sharing his experience had illuminated a hidden population of young people providing family care. The episode that aired 8 weeks later became one of the most impactful in Family Feud history. The response was overwhelming, with over 300,000 messages from viewers, many from families dealing with Alzheimer's and other conditions requiring long-term care. Steve Harvey said in interviews that Jake's episode changed how he understood both maturity and family commitment. "I met a young man that day who had learned the hardest lesson in life, that love sometimes requires us to give up what we want for what others need," he explained. The jacket Steve gave Jake hangs in his bedroom now, next to photos of him with his grandfather from before the diagnosis. Jake Thompson is now 17, still providing care for his grandfather while maintaining honor roll status. With respite care support, he's been able to rejoin the basketball team while continuing his caregiving responsibilities. The lesson Jake Thompson taught that Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta is profound. Strength isn't about avoiding difficult responsibilities, it's about choosing how to handle them with grace, dignity, and love. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who quietly carry burdens others can't see, and who understand that growing up means learning to give rather than just receive. And sometimes it takes a 16-year-old caregiver with an oversized suit jacket to remind a television studio full of people that the most important work happens in ordinary moments, when love transforms duty into privilege and caring becomes the highest form of courage. Because that's what real maturity looks like. That's what family devotion sounds like. And that's what happens when a game show becomes a platform for understanding that some of the strongest people on earth choose to carry what life asks of them, regardless of their age, and find meaning in service rather than recognition.